episode of American Spirits, hosted here on the Old Glory Club's YouTube channel. I am Charlemagne, and I am joined by Ryan Turnipseed, my co host for this new show that we're debuting today. And also joining us on the bottom of the screen is Oberon Quinn. Uh, Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself really quick?
Yes, thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm very excited for this because this will hopefully mark the start of a long tradition here at the club, going through some more, going more in depth into some higher level topics, which has been in a short supply in recent years. But otherwise, I don't have much more to say than thank you for having me on, and pretty excited.
Indeed, as some viewers may know, you and I have done book review streams before, long in the past now, at least in terms of how we measure time. So I'm very excited to be doing this again with you. And we also have an additional guest today. As I said, Oberon Quinn. Would you like to introduce yourself really quick?
Hello, thank you very much. I am over the moon at the honor of being chosen to join you gentlemen on your inaugural stream. I am sure that this show will go on to great heights and that it's going to be one for the ages.
Indeed. So, on this inaugural stream, we are in fact covering the book Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher, and we will go ahead and get right into it. So, to introduce the book, uh, we will cover the main four American or the main four groups of people who migrated to America primarily in the 17th century. Some of the book covers the 18th century as well. And his book is divided into these four main sections, and those groups are the Puritans, the Cavaliers, who migrated to Virginia, the Quakers, who migrated to Pennsylvania, and finally the Backcountry Peoples, who migrated basically to the Appalachian mountain regions up and down the entire country. And so, to start with, if we could bring up the map of where the Puritans migrated from, and I will give you a brief description of those people for your understanding as we go through these four groups and cover their various ways and traditions, which is what the book focuses on. All of the chapters are divided into sections on various folk ways, and we'll be comparing and contrasting these four key groups of people who made America what it is today. So the first group, the Puritans, migrated from East Anglia, as you can see pictured on the screen. Now, of course, all of these groups came from different parts of England in terms of their individual membership, but primarily they came from specific regions. And the Puritans, especially, came from East Anglia and journeyed to Massachusetts primarily, is where they settled initially. Now, the Puritans, unlike the other three groups that we're going to talk about, were much more homogenous. A group of English Puritans, they were also homogenous in terms of their class. It was a very deliberately middle class movement that migrated from East Anglia to America. And this was done intentionally by the Puritan leadership in order to ensure that the people who settled in the New World would be fit to stay and live there. And in fact, some people were sent back to England because they couldn't cut it. So the Puritans were not composed of upper rank people and also excluded lower rank people. And that created a particular culture in Massachusetts that we will speak much more in depth about as we go on. But just to finish introducing the Puritans, I'll go ahead and read a little note I have from page 39 of the book describing the little elite. And David Hackett Fisher writes, quote, "This little elite was destined to play a large role in history in the history of New England. Its strength developed in no small degree from its solidarity. Many of its members had known one another before coming to America. They had gone to the same schools. Nearly half had studied in 3 Cambridge colleges: Emmanuel, Magdalen, and Trinity. Approximately 30% had attended Emmanuel alone. They intermarried with such frequency that one historian describes the leading Puritan families of East Anglia as a prospographer's dream. So hopefully that sets the stage for how homogenous this group was. Ryan, is there anything, or Oberon, are there any other introductory remarks you guys would like to mention on the Puritans before we briefly describe the Cavaliers?
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, especially as we start discussing the finer details of the Puritans and their influence on the United States, or I should say on America, rather. But you have to understand that these people were very religiously committed. Everything that they did was viewed through their doctrines and faith. And if you try to in any way separate that from the Puritans, I don't think you're going to be able to understand why they did what they did, and why their society developed in the ways that it historically did. You have to understand their religion is formed from a very specific sect of Calvinism that was not entirely universal among the Calvinists. It was a very interesting project, as you've sort of been discussing.
It's also important to note how self-conscious this solidarity we're going to discuss was. Typically, to go over there, there were property qualifications as well as religious qualifications. They insisted that you have a good living and you have the means to set yourself up in the New World, and they often insisted that you come recommended by other Puritans. And then, just by way of side note, I'll fly my flag here. I am myself of Puritan descent.
Indeed, and unlike the Virginia Cavaliers, which we can now move on to, the Puritans were highly self-selected, whereas the makeup of the Cavaliers was significantly different. So if we could bring up the map of where the Cavaliers came from. Excellent. Okay, yes. So the group known as the Cavaliers migrated primarily to Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of Virginia from the southwest of England, as you can see pictured on the screen now. And of course, again, to mention, all of these groups had members come from different parts of England. They weren't entirely 100% only from the regions pictured, but primarily they're from the counties you see pictured here. And these maps are actually showing the areas loyal to King John on the right here. So one of the characteristics of the Virginians that causes them to differ from the other groups that came in is the fact that they were Royalists and Anglicans. They weren't Calvinists, and they weren't other types of Protestant. They were Anglicans primarily, and that religious origin causes them to differ quite a lot from the people in New England. Now, if we could bring up page 227, we have a bit here about the social origins specifically of the Cavaliers. Now, the Cavaliers, as it is written here, quote, Virginia's second Great Migration differed from the Puritan exodus to Massachusetts in many ways, in its English origins, its American destination, and especially in its social composition. New England had drawn mostly from the middle of English society. Virginians came in great numbers from both higher and lower ranks. In quantitative terms, Sir William Berkeley's distressed Cavaliers were only a small part of the total flow to the Chesapeake colonies. The great mass of Virginia's immigrants were humble people of low rank. More than 75% came as indentured servants. So consider that in the initial waves of migration, 3/4 of the people who came to America under the Virginia colony's rule were indentured servants. It should also be pointed out, I didn't make a particular note of this, but it should be pointed out that this was a pre-existing colony that was established by the crown, and the colony had serious problems in running itself. So it was sent a man to govern the colony in order to basically repair what was essentially initially a pretty rough, and you might even say failing society. And it is this wave of migration that really defined what its culture was. Ryan, would you like to add any additional commentary here?
Yeah, so similarly to the Puritans, where their very specific denomination is what, and the beliefs that the people had towards that is what shaped their society. You must understand with the Virginians or the Cavaliers, the Royalists, whatever you want to use to denote them, that they were primarily focused on the hierarchy, the bloodlines, the ruling elite, the ruling class, if you will. If you don't understand the focus on this hierarchy, the theology behind it, the beliefs around it, and then the laws that formed around it as well, you won't understand Virginia and the people that settled there. And especially when we get into this later, they have some very strange laws that might conflict with people's views about how based they are, for lack of a better word. There's sort of a meme that's gone around. As we get into the details of their laws, people might start to revise that, but they have to understand there was a reason behind it, and it was an acceptable reason, especially for the English Cavaliers, which is that it was laws centered around the hierarchy. It maintained the hierarchy, made the hierarchy more formalized, efficient, and allowed people to propagate their own lineages. So that's something that the audience should keep in mind, is that this is at the heart of the Virginian society.
Yeah, two things to add to that. First off, a note on indentured servitude and what it tells us about the time preferences of these groups. At the time, Hackett Fischer tells us that the passage to New England or to the New World was approximately a year's middle income salary. So a middle class person would need to save up a year's salary just to get over there. So whereas with the Puritans, you're seeing them, okay, you got to save the money and you got to come here, pay your passage, and be able to set yourself up. With Virginia, you've got people essentially borrowing, with the collateral being their own lives, to get over there to the New World. So that in itself kind of sets us up to examine the different ways these cultures looked at money and looked at time. The second thing is more of an anecdote that I'll note, which is that the Cavaliers did try to go to Massachusetts. They set up a colony there called Merrymount, Merry. And in 1628, the Puritans decided that Merrymount was, in fact, the Babylon of Merrymount, invaded and forcibly expelled the Cavaliers.
Now, another interesting bit about the Cavaliers, and again, this William Berkeley, if I failed to mention, was the man sent to govern Virginia as its royal governor in order to fix the ailing colony. And the culture we're going to describe was really put in place by him and the people he brought along during his tenure. And the history of this people, like all of the peoples we are going to be talking about, go deep into English history. The Cavaliers in particular, though, have what one might call one of the older cultures in England. If we look at page 241, I will read a quotation from there. Page 241, quote, "Through many centuries, this area," we're talking about southern England here, "this area developed its own distinctive culture. Its language and laws were those of the West Saxons, rather than the Danes who settled East Anglia, or the Norse who colonized the North Country, or the Celts who held Cornwall and Wales. Its shires were divided into hundreds rather than wapentakes. Its tax units were reckoned in hides instead of caracates. Its weights and measures were Old British rather than Scandinavian." So the takeaway here is that this is one of the older English cultures before the Norman conquests and before the Danes. And in fact, the Dane law was never imposed upon this part of England. So these people represent an ancient culture, and that was carried with them to the United States, or to America, what would become the United States.
And just to jump in very quickly on that, this is why if you hear Southern politicians, especially in eras past, talking about the South being the Anglo-Saxon heartland. That was a very literal meaning. It is descended from a more Anglo-Saxon English culture.
Precisely. Additionally, if we bring up page 242, I will read the political character of southwestern England was consistent with its social history. This was the territory that remained loyal to King John in 1215. It rallied to Richard II in 1381 and generally stood by the Tudors in the mid 16th century. Most of this region supported the Stuarts during the Civil War. With a few exceptions, it was stony ground for Puritan proselytizers and dissenting denominations in the 17th century. So these people were not dissenters. They were highly conservative, hyper conservative, perhaps one might say. So I think that is sufficient. Actually, I do have one more. There are a couple more things we could cover here on the Virginians. And let's go to page 246. And I won't read out this entire quotation from page 246, but one of the interesting things is the author of the book describes how he went to southwest England and he felt at home there. And this is to basically emphasize this idea that the people who came to America brought their full culture with them. And even to this day, the region that they came from in the southwest of England is somewhat familiar. I should say 1989 is when this book was written, but at least at that time, southwestern England was familiar to a man who had come from this part of the country. And this sort of emphasizes the idea that the cultures we find in America were not simply generated upon people's arrivals to these shores, but they're fundamentally English in their origination.
Right, and you can we'll get to this next week, I think, and in the future streams, but this is also where like the southern drawl comes from. It's a very slowed version of the accent that can be found in the West Country in particular.
And again, if we move to page 252, I again won't read the whole quote, but we can bring it up on the screen. Basically, Mr. Fisher describes the issues that the Virginians had with disease. So the Puritans, and as we'll get to, the Quakers, because of the colder climate, they did not have the same issues that the Virginians had with these seasonal diseases that were extremely deadly. So there was basically a dying season in the Virginian colony that affected their time ways in ways that other parts of the country were not. We can also note here in this passage, it is mentioned that travelers to Virginia found them to be idle, indolent, and sluggish, and had quick tempers. And this is pretty characteristic for people who live in warmer climates. I just found that kind of interesting because this is characteristic of the South as well to this day. And it's not purely because of a laziness of character, but really something the heat does to people. So it's quite interesting how the environments themselves, as this chapter discusses, define how these colonies developed. And of course, the Chesapeake Bay itself was quite essential to how Virginia developed. But we will get it more into that later. Anything else you guys want to mention on Virginia before we move to the Quakers?
I think this is a fine overview.
Excellent. So moving on to the Quakers. Now, the Quakers, some might say that what certain people blame for the Puritans, blame on the Puritans, is actually really could be blamed on the Quakers, but we will get more into that.
It's kind of nuanced.
It's very nuanced, actually. Page 429 discusses the ethnic origins of the Quakers, and before I read that, I'll also mention that the Quakers. It is known that the Quakers came to America in some major part because of religious persecution. But Mr. Fisher points out that the primary goal of the Quakers' migration to America were positive rather than negative. So they didn't leave England because of persecution. that played a role in it, but actually their main interest was basically finding a place where they could show Quakerism at work. Basically, to fully develop a Quaker society free of any prior existing constraints on what sort of country they could build. They couldn't do this in England because they were particularly persecuted for their ways, and that is what caused them to come to America, particularly the Delaware Valley area and Pennsylvania. So on page 429 here, as we have on screen, the Quakers, or the Friends, as they referred to themselves, had some peculiar ideas. They had this idea, perhaps one might even say a Gnostic idea, of an inner light, which is sort of the presence of God within everyone. And more interesting in this particular quotation I have here, though, is the description of the Quakers as being a diverse peoples, because unlike the other groups we're going to talk about, which were primarily not only English, but from very specific areas of England, the Quakers actually welcomed people of other ethnicities, provided they were also Quakers. And that would be, immigrants, or not immigrants, but settlers alongside them, who were French, Dutch, German, Swedish, Danish, Finnish, Scottish, as well as English. So we shouldn't overemphasize the diversity of the Quaker colony, as it primarily was English, but they had other groups of people that the other colonies only had a few members of. And they actually welcomed these people rather than sought to drive them out. And something about the, Cavaliers, for example, who we talked about previously, they were described in the book as being highly xenophobic, and they basically didn't like any other group that wasn't the Virginia Cavaliers from the southwest of England. But the Quakers are quite the opposite. Were very, very open to these other groups, provided they fit in with their religious ways. And like the Puritans, if you did not fit into their religious mode of government and society, then you were simply not welcome there. Now, would any of you like to add anything to, I'm sure you would, on the Quakers in introduction?
Yes. So this is I remember when I was researching for a video that I was wanting to release on my channel, but have since lost the script. It was supposed to be the first one that I released. I remember I was going through the demographic makeup of the colonies. So it's worth emphasizing that the Quakers, more than any of the other group, had a lot of Welsh influence. They were, but still anglicized, especially by this point. But there is that factor, and this sort of Anglo and Welsh demographic makeup of what was originally the Quaker strongholds in the colonies would dwindle to a minority status. It was a minority majority colony, mostly of Europeans. But by the time of the American Revolution, they were most certainly not demographically healthy if they were going for a majority population. That's the first thing that I would really like to point out. And on a meta level, I hope the audience is kind of getting this idea that these groups are not exactly perfectly different from each other. They have a lot of commonalities. They also have a lot of differences. So if anyone, hopefully everyone that has the idea by now that these colonies fit into good and bad categories. One is obviously the enemy, subversive, all the problems came from it. Other ones are obviously good, all the good things came from it. Hopefully that is starting to fade away, just because the commonalities are such that if you condemn one of these groups, you're probably going to end up condemning all four. That's all I'd like to add.
Yeah, the theme is going to continue to emerge through this stream and through this entire show, I think, that when we pound upon the vices of one group or another, and we're going to eventually grapple with the Puritan hypothesis that Curtis Yarvin put forward, that modern day progressivism is entirely to be laid at the foot of the Puritans. We're going to see that this is not an accurate picture. We're going to see that each of the groups had tendencies within them that find echoes in modern leftism. And we're also going to see that each of these groups had countervailing virtues, which prevented them in their time from degenerating into what we would recognize as a modern leftism. And as we track the history of these groups, we're going to track a winnowing of the American virtues which kept us from the brink, and of the animating spirit of those virtues, referring particularly here to Christian faith. And we're going to track how modern leftism, sort of arose from all three, as from all four, as all four, gave way to their vices and winnowed out their virtues.
Now, sort of the purpose of the Quaker experiment, the holy experiment, as it was called, unlike the Cavaliers, who, William Berkeley selected very specific noble families to accompany him to the colony. The Quakers were seeking something a bit different than what the other two colonies were. It's a little bit similar to the Puritans, but the Quakers had this idea of basically religious liberty, the liberty of conscience. Sorry. Now, that's not to say that the Quakers were fine with everyone believing, anything. They only wanted Quakers within their colony, but their idea of liberty stemmed from this idea that you had this inner consciousness, this inner connection, this direct connection to God that should be allowed to put itself to act in the world, let's say. So we will get more into that as we continue talking about these groups, but just for introductory sake, let's move on to the backcountry peoples. And let's see, we can bring up page 618 for this. Now, the backcountry migration, actually, we forgot to bring up the map of the Quakers. Why don't we do that really quick before moving on to here we go. So, before moving on to the backcountry Quaker people, we can point out that the Quakers actually mostly came from the north of England. I'm not sure if you could make out the particular text below each image. That's fine. If not, the point here is these are the areas that the Quakers primarily came from. So north of England. So again, to review, the Puritans are East Anglia, the Cavaliers are Southwest England, and the Quakers are Northern England. Now, moving on to the backcountry people, and if we could bring up actually the map of where the backcountry peoples came from, we can see that some of them also came from Northern England, but they also came from the Scottish Highlands and also northeastern Ireland. Now, the actual ethnicity of these peoples are often incorrectly described as Scotch-Irish, because what these maps here are showing in part is the port from which the peoples sailed. So one might have left for the New World from a port out of Ireland or Scotland, while in fact being ethnically English. So simply tracking where ships sailed from does not actually give you a direct understanding of what the ethnicity of these peoples are. And why are they called backcountry? Well, it's because they migrated to the backcountry, the wilderness, the frontier of America at the time, which is the Appalachian Mountains. And now the Appalachian Mountains are primarily known for, the Great Smokies in the Tennessee area. But of course, the Appalachian Mountain Range extends all the way from the northern end of the country pretty far into the south, Alabama, Georgia, that sort of thing, all the way up to Ohio, Pennsylvania. So this is a large part of the country that these people are migrating to. And in terms of this concept of the Scotch-Irish, let's bring up the page 618 quote I have up here, and I'll actually read it. So page 618, quote, "Some historians describe these immigrants as Ulster Irish or Northern Irish. It is true that many sailed from the province of Ulster in Northern Ireland, but these labels are not accurate when applied to the movement as a whole. The emigration from Ulster was part of a much larger flow which drew from the lowlands of Scotland, the north of England, and every side of the Irish Sea. Many scholars call these people Scotch-Irish. That expression is an Americanism, rarely used in Britain and much resented by the people to whom it was attached. We're not Irish, but Scotch, one of them was heard to say in Pennsylvania. Some preferred to be called Anglo-Irish, a label that was more commonly applied to them than Scotch-Irish during the 18th century. Others were called Saxon Scotch. One scholar writes, some Ulster Protestants derived from families that were not Scottish at all, but English or Irish. He adds, some immigrant groups that historians have labeled as Scots-Irish never lived in Ireland, but came directly from Scotland. End quote. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the sort of broad, but primarily British, as we would call it in the modern time, lumping all these groups together. That should give you some idea of the ethnic breakdowns of these people. They came from many different parts of the British Isles, and simply calling them Scotch-Irish is pretty inaccurate. So there are a couple more things to say here, but before I go further myself, Ryan, Oberon, do you have anything you want to add on the Backcountry Peoples?
Just a
yes.
note. Go ahead,
on.
Ryan.
Okay. So the thing that I would like to add is that something to keep in mind as well is that the author of this book is very acceptable in the mainstream. He's not controversial. This book is highly regarded. And some of the proof of that is that this section on the backcountry is used in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, trying to explain why do people in Kentucky act the way they do, even if they aren't necessarily descended from the original English that settled it. So this is a very well-regarded, if not mainstream theory at this point. It's not esoteric knowledge, what we're going through. The other thing that I would like to add as well is that this is the emphasis on the herding, the shepherding culture, the sort of the very self-reliant, honor-based, if not if more violent culture that one can find from the hilly regions of northern England, the borderlands, Scotland, and then those people that settled in Northern Ireland are going to be the main thing that shapes their society in America, but it is not going to make them backwards necessarily. We'll get into that more in a lot more detail, but if anyone in the audience comes away with this idea that the backcountry was like this backwards, uncivilized group of savages that were just sent in to fight natives, that would be a very wrong view of this folkway.
And then just kind of an amusing note on how this Scottish-Irish distinction would evolve through the early period of the United States proper. If you go through newspapers from the 1790s, the 1800s, the 1810s, on into the 1840s, and you look at the want ads, what you'll see in the 1790s is a near universal proviso that Scottish need not apply. And then as we move into the 19th century, it gradually morphs from Scottish need not apply to Irish need not apply.
Now, there's a couple more things to point out here just in introducing these people, which we need to get into the concept of border violence. So this is the idea, at the time, the Scottish lowlands and the north of England wasn't entirely safe in terms of things like highwaymen and that sort of thing. So there's a violence built into the culture because there's a necessity for being able to distribute it yourself when some higher governing power is not available. Not to mention, these people have a long history of violence with the English themselves. On page 632, there's a quote that says, "These people were refugees from a great historical transformation which had caught them in its complex coils." And of course, what the author is referring to there is basically the defeat and subjugation of Scotland that the English were basically finally able to achieve around when these people were migrating. The Scottish kings had been defeated, English rule brought to the British Isles, and these people are, caught in this maelstrom, basically. Another thing, the borderers, as he calls them, primarily entered through the ports of Philadelphia and Newcastle. This caused some issues with the Quakers. So the Quakers, one thing about the Quakers is they were nonviolent peoples, right? And they let's say, providentially settled in an area where the natives were fairly friendly. The Quakers did not want these backcountry people around, so they actually shipped them to western Pennsylvania, basically as a buffer between them and the Indians. So a lot of the people we're talking about as backcountry people actually came in through the Quaker colony in Philadelphia. And let's see, anything else do I have here? Yeah. Page 639, I'll just read a quick quote I have. Before the borderers arrived, the backcountry was occupied by strong and warlike Indian nations from the Shawnee in the north to the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw in the south. These proud people did not give way easily before white settlement. Savage warfare began in the late 17th century and continued to the early 19th century in some of the fiercest Indian wars of American history, end quote. So, of course, this also ties into the theme of violence. These people needed to be able to do battle with Indians in order to survive. Now, moving on from that topic, there's another bit about the backcountry peoples we want to comment on, which is this thing called the ascendancy. So, in Ireland, there was this small group of elites known as the ascendancy, who were within the people who migrated to the Americas. And you can think of this ascendancy, I think of it kind of like the Cavalier elites, actually, in terms of their cultural impact, although they were very different people. But the people who belong to this ascendancy, you'll recognize the names. It's the families Calhoun, Polk, Jackson, Henry, Houston, Bell, Graham, Bankhead. These are all backcountry elites, and these families dominated the backcountry society for generations. Would you guys like to add anything else, or shall we conclude our introduction phase?
Since I don't know any better place to put this in the stream, I suppose I should say that as the border pushed westward, especially after American independence, and these folkways developed into new things and sometimes merged, you can see that certain westward territories function more as blends of these cultures rather than pure members. So for instance, my state of Oklahoma is not fully the South, nor is it fully the backcountry, but rather it functions as sort of a blend. Indeed, there's a lot of settlers from the Northeast and from the Mid-Atlantic that settled in the cities. So you have this sort of rural culture that's a blend of the South and the backcountry, and the urban culture, which is a blend of the Quakers and the Puritans. And you can find this for just about any other Western state. When we discuss the sort of hypothesis that Puritans caused progressivism, we'll get into this because this is part of the more academic expression of it. But this is something to avoid, is trying to pigeonhole specific states, and that goes for basically any state a few generations after the founding, into one of these four categories as if they're mutually exclusive, when that's not the case. They'll blend, they'll take ideas from each other, some of them will develop in a different way. So that's something to keep in mind. This is not like a personality test where you will fall into one category, your state will fall into a specific category, and that predicts who settled it, what is it going to do in the future, why is society is the way it is. These folkways will blend. So I felt like that would be properly placed at this point.
Indeed, my own folkways extend to some extent from the Virginia Cavaliers, but also the backcountry peoples. Definitely, it is important to treat this work seriously and not as some sort of horoscope test. That's absolutely not the point of what we're doing here. And speaking of the point of what we're doing here, I know one of the things that was mentioned and something we want to cover is particularly what's come to be known as the Puritan hypothesis. Now, this is something you, Ryan, particularly had some notes on. So at this point, I will hand the reins to you in order to start taking us through anything you want to cover on the Puritans. We'll go back to the original group we had talked about in the intro. Again, just to recap, the groups are the Puritans in Massachusetts, the Virginia Cavaliers, the Delaware Valley and Pennsylvania Quakers, and all of these backcountry peoples throughout the Appalachians. So these are the 4 groups to keep in your mind. Actually, before I hand it to you as well, I should just mention super chats can be done on Entropy. We can bring them up on screen and everything. YouTube super chats down right now, but super chat us on Entropy. It's better to do it there anyway because they take less of the cut of the money. That should be linked in the show notes. So feel free to send super chats. We've already got a number of them in, and we will read them at the end of the show. So yeah, if you haven't signed up for Entropy by now, it's a great time to do it. Anyway, on to you, Ryan.
All right, thank you, Charlemagne. So there's this idea that's been popular in libertarian circles and then neo-reactionary circles, since it was sort of a synthesis of libertarianism and a few other right-wing ideologies, that the origins of American progressivism, which especially as it culminated in FDR's New Deal, both domestic and foreign policy, should come naturally as an enemy to most people that are watching right now. There's this idea that it has its origins in the Puritans in particular. There's a few variants of this theory, some that are more academic and more defensible, some that have become like a meme that's been very, I would say, harmful to any idea of American heritage, viewing it in a positive light. So I should say that if you Google the phrase Puritan hypothesis, you're going to get like Wikipedia's very mild version, which was originally like a scientific history idea that the amount of Protestant pietists correlated with the focus on scientific empiricism. So that's like a very mild way of putting it. There's been a more extensive way of putting it. It has academic origins, but most people would either know this idea from either Murray Rothbard or Curtis Yarvin. And the more defensible form, the more mature form, is that as the Puritan stock moved westward into the Midwest in particular, they somewhat secularized. And you can see this in a lot of the people that came out of those regions. For instance, Abraham Lincoln attended churches, but he was never quite a member. He most certainly did not have the centerpiece of faith that the Puritans had. And this sort of more secularized, more modern Puritan culture developed into what we would know today sort of as American leftism, or as a progressivism in its older, as they described it in their own works, Rothbard and Yarvin. Yarvin, if I remember correctly, does not lay progressivism as the fault of any believing Puritan. He just claims that progressivism is so similar in its secular form to the Puritans that it's so obviously traceable to them. So this is something to keep in mind. That's the hypothesis. The Puritans, in its more defensible form, the Puritans caused progressivism and that it got secularized later. And this is primarily a Puritan phenomenon. But the evidence presented in this book, Albion Seed, I think contradicts that to a pretty extreme degree. Let me see if I can pull up my own screenshots for my own notes real quick. But so that's the idea. I have a screenshot on the Puritans' attitudes towards novelty, which I am getting to now. My apologies.
Yeah, while you look for that, I recall that
there we go.
I believe you have another one at some point on the Puritan idea of Reformation being much more reactionary than progressive as well.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I'm going to start with. I'll work my way to the novelty. So there's a statement from Fisher's book here that, and I'll read the important parts. Which it's very brief. He says, as that statement implies, reform was regarded in Massachusetts mainly as a process of recovery and preservation. Reformation meant going backward rather than forward, on the assumption that error was novel and truth was ancient in the world. The Protestant Reformation meant a reversion to primitive Christianity. In politics, reform was a return to the ancient constitution. In society, it meant a revival of ancestral ways. So this is sort of at the heart of not even just the Puritan faith, but also the Calvinist faith. They don't think that they are novel innovators. In fact, most of the conservative branches, the actual believing ones today, would balk at that idea. The Reformation was about creating new doctrine. Regardless of whether it's correct or incorrect, this is what the belief was. They would not have viewed themselves as novel innovators trying to engineer a society into something that was new, novel, progressive, egalitarian, or any of this other stuff. They thought that they were really going back in history, instituting an older form of civilization, and this is at the heart of what basically every Puritan had to believe in order to live in these colonies.
Yeah, much like the Cluniacs before them and the Franciscans before them, this is, a common strain throughout Christian reform movements. Is we was disciples, to put it crudely, and again, without commenting on the historicity of that attitude, that was the attitude, and it is a distinctly reactionary and anti-Whig progressive way to look at the world.
Right. So this I think refutes sort of the meme that has taken hold online that Puritanism is progressivism, which, if you remember, is not the actual statement that we started with from Yarvin at Rothbard. It's the secularized form of Puritanism has taken hold. The meme view, I think, is indefensible. The Puritans were not progressives. Their laws, which we'll get into in a moment to sort of demonstrate this, were not progressive. In fact, they were sort of seen as extreme and very traditional to a point of being backwards by a lot of the by the rest of the world. So this goes into, I guess I should say, we should jump into the laws right now. I can't find the part on banning novelty, which is very unfortunate. Just because of how this is formatted.
Yeah, I don't recall where that was in the notes. Should we just start sort of at the beginning of the ways and look at family ways?
I mean, we can. The notes that I took sort of as I was reading along, and I basically stated most of what we're going to get into, and we'll be slowly working through this idea that the Puritan hypothesis is not as correct as it's made out to be. So the first thing that we can bring up is the Puritans' views towards children. Progressives have had a view towards children basically since they've been around. Children bring about some form of novelty. They're a sort of higher state of life. They have more creativity, all these other things, which especially the American education system emphasizes. The Puritans did not have so much of that view, to the point that they had this practice called breaking the will of the child. And Charlie, I'm sure you'll comment on this more, since this was something you focused in on. But this has to do with their organizing of society around elders. They had this idea of like a sort of holy elder that would help govern the colony. He had seen and experienced much. He had developed in faith and his own piety. He was strong and capable. And these elders, who often lived to very old ages and were very prominent throughout American history, were sort of the pinnacle of the Puritan society, whereas the children, with their sort of rebellious will, had to be broken in that sense by their parents and made to respect this idea. So this is I would say this would be point one in breaking this idea that Puritan practices are necessarily progressive. This is not necessarily what the progressives idolize.
Yes, and not only does this apply to elders, but it also applies in a parallel way to clergy. I remember one anecdote from the book where a visitor to Massachusetts asked the local parson if you were the parson who serves this town, and the gentleman replied, "No, sir, I am the parson who rules this town." The clergy wielded immense influence in Puritan society along the same lines.
Right. So, any other comments before moving on to their morbidity, shall we say?
Just on child rearing, this concept of sending out, which is this sort of community-oriented way of raising your children, where at some point your children would be sent to be raised in another household for some amount of time, in order to uh, improve the breadth of learning of the child, so that they might learn lessons they did not learn in their own home because of some unique factor of the other home.
Not just
And
breadth, but quality. They had this idea that you would be, more polite and better behaved in a stranger's house than you would in your own families.
or this might be used to remove the child from some problematic place that he was misbehaving in, or get him closer to a school for him to be enrolled in. So it's worth mentioning this aspect of Puritan child rearing as well.
Yeah,
On
it
their
was also not uncommon to send them out to escape a plague that was ravaging the area, and practical things like that. There were often a lot of cases as well where one of the parents had died and they sent the child away to another household for a while because of that. So there were many reasons to do so.
I have a few things to bring up on their age ways as well. If you want to get into the elders a bit, what do you think, Ryan?
That is slightly further down on the list, just because I have a bit about the Puritan elders being of a little bit higher quality, perhaps, than our present ones.
Yes.
But something before we move on from it, this is also sort of contrary to a right-wing meme that's arisen. That was, I think it reached its peak in popularity probably in 2021, 2022 maybe. This idea that the nuclear family and the emphasis on the nuclear family is novel, it destroys society, it acidifies it, and whatnot else. The Puritans organized by the nuclear family. I think we'll get into that in a moment. And they sent their children away from that nuclear family's household. And yet somehow Puritan society did not dissolve, atomize, and whatever else. It does not look like what we're dealing with now with family formation and all these other things. If one wants to make the claim that the nuclear family causes a society to disintegrate, or that sending children away necessarily causes a society to disintegrate, this is not the case. We have a historical evidence otherwise. Now, something that's an important qualifier is that there is a basically infinite amount of land on the continent at that point. So if a child was sent out, they could have their own plot of land. That's not necessarily so now. Parents were supportive. When children get sent out of the house now, that's not necessarily the case. But this is I think a sort of right-wing meme to suffocate just a little bit. This idea that the nuclear family is bad, it's novel, disintegrates society. We have a very neat working example here at the Puritans, which formed part of the country, that this is not the case.
Indeed, this is why we are going to see different ways of understanding the family amongst the four groups, because the cultural context in which they evolve lends itself to different family organizations, and we cannot draw conclusions from one that the one is optimal, one is not. It fits both the times and, as you alluded to, the economic circumstances in which human beings find themselves in.
Right, and this is also something to emphasize as well. This is also, once again, not very progressive. It's not progressives balk at like the old boarding schools, sending your children away to go do all this other stuff. It's a very conservative coded thing, if you will. So this is once again, in terms of just their basic practices, if you copied this from Puritans to seculars, like I'm sure they would mess it up because they don't have this core Congregationalist doctrine guiding them. But if you just mimic the practice, you don't end up with a progressive society here either. So, Charlemagne, you said you had stuff on the ageways, or did we want to move on?
No, I was looking through your notes. There's definitely more on the family, which is prior to in the book we should cover, such as the purpose of family being a means to an end, a religious end, that is.
Should I read that out, perhaps? Because I think this was very revealing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Mr. David Hackett Fisher writes, "The people of Massachusetts thought of the family not as an end in itself, but as an instrument of their highest religious purposes. The Puritan writer Jonathan Mitchell declared, "A Christian may and ought to desire many things as means, but God alone as his end." This was their way of thinking about the family in particular, which was also described as the root whence church and commonwealth cometh. So this I find interesting because there's a sort of a growing aesthetics trad movement online that does view family as an end. But we have a society here that had probably some of the largest sustained families over time in a nuclear layout. So this was an Anglo-Saxon, or I shouldn't say Anglo-Saxon necessarily, though it did come from the Angles. But this English nuclear family, we'll discuss in future streams the generational cohort sizes. I think the average number of children per household was somewhere in the double digits. And yet they didn't have to indoctrinate themselves into believing that family is the end, like it's what you're working towards. It was extremely important. So that's not to say this is to be discounted, but there are other ways to achieve this, and we can find it in our own history. I found that was what my takeaway from this was. It was a very interesting way of viewing the family.
Yeah, well, it's a sizzling rebuke to the phenomenon that is embodied in the "I just want to grill" meme. Family is not conceived of as a material condition in which to raise optimal young. It has a spiritual end to it, to essentially save souls, to get human beings into union with God. And the family is properly directed towards that end, whatever culture you're in. But the Puritans were more conscious of this than some of the others we'll discuss.
Yes, they also one of the interesting things about how they develop their families is their naming custom. How there was a strong emphasis on passing on names to their children, much more than some of the other groups, and actually more than all the other groups, specifically to their the firstborn son of a family receiving a larger portion than the others, as well as would be biblically mandated. They paid much more attention to that than did some of the other groups. Particularly, this differentiates them from the Quakers quite a bit.
Right, and on the subject of passing things on as well to children, this pattern of the nuclear family persisted in inheritance as well. Very little property left towards the extended family, and yet, and this should probably be emphasized just as a matter of economic history, New England was not this poor backwater area of the country. It's definitely more rural than it would be 100 to 200 years later, but it's not doing poorly. So this combination of strict nuclear families, they pass everything on to their children, basically, including their names. So not just heritage, but material goods. Children sometimes get sent away to go learn and develop as a person. And also, the family itself isn't even the goal. This is all just a means towards their religious ends. This is I would not say that we have found so far anything that is progressive in action. Definitely not in intent.
Certainly, and this is as good a time as any to insert that the same theological end towards which the family is directed is the same theological end towards which their entire society was directed to some extent. The shining city on a hill meme that America is the shining city comes from the Puritans. That was, I think, Winthrop's turn of phrase. But as we see the way they're directed towards this, yes, you can find some echoes of that in the progressive attitude of, perfecting earthly society and perfecting man, the old communist idea. But as we see how it was actually practiced in context, it is a very, very long leap to get there.
Right, and even contextualizing the beliefs, if one concluded that the Puritans had a divine goal that they were trying to, at least striving to get towards, not necessarily achieve for a good chunk of them, if we're going to say that that is progressivism, then just having lofty goals or even divine goals becomes progressivism. It's a very strange inference, not one that I would make.
Perhaps the closest we could get to any sort of progressive orientation, which would definitely be not the correct word to apply, but their marriage and gender customs perhaps have an inkling of what you might call gender equality, but
Yeah,
very,
marriage.
very loosely applied.
Yeah, that I assume that's what we're transitioning to now, and then I'll just bookmark the other thing that you could find resonances with progressivism in the Puritan folkways is the idea of election and how that might have transmogrified into the modern day practice of virtue signaling. But let's go into the equality of the sexes.
Yes. So just so people have an idea of what laws we're about to start discussing and equality and all this other stuff, the Puritans did implement the laws that they thought were necessary by their theology. So just to quote something here, so as not to cut anything short or downplay anything, Fisher writes, divorce customs also differed from other English-speaking cultures. The Puritans recognized many grounds for divorce that were consistent with their conception of marriage. The statutes of Connecticut allowed for divorce for adultery, fraudulent contract, willful desertion and total neglect for 3 years, and providential absence for 7 years. Massachusetts granted divorces in the 17th century for adultery, desertion, cruelty, and failure to provide. Physical violence was also recognized as a ground for divorce. Husbands and wives were forbidden to strike one another in Massachusetts. There was no such thing as moderate correction in the laws of this colony. The courts often intervened in cases of wife beating and sometimes of husband beating too. So this is before we get to like the part specifically on legal equality and the actual application of these laws, this is what we're dealing with. As we'll see, compared to the Anglicans especially, the Puritans were much more lenient towards divorce. And this is only by relativity. They did not view divorce as a good thing. It was not encouraged. This is just the incidents by which one could obtain one. So the Puritans really punished divorce as well as granting divorces for it. So let me see if I can find that excerpt real quick. Something else that's good to note as well is that before we get to executing these laws in a sort of equal manner, this is the wife was viewed sort of as the administrator of the household or the head of the family. So this is also getting to perhaps a slightly more progressive idea. Fisher writes, a Puritan writer also argued that though the husband be the head of the wife, yet she is the head of the family. Custom as well as law in the Bay Colony required husbands to treat their wives not only with decency but respect. When a man in Essex County told his spouse that she was none of his wife, she was but a servant, the neighbors brought a criminal complaint against him, and though the wife herself refused to support the prosecution, he was heavily fined by the court. So that's I would be willing to call that progressive, certainly, but not the core of progressivism, perhaps.
It is interesting in that instance that it was the neighbors who made a court case out of it.
Yeah, right. And the wife herself refused to support it. So for anyone that studies American history, you especially in the modern era, you've probably heard of this concept of Republican motherhood, this idea that the job of the wife or the mother in the household is to inculcate the children in the household with like proper political theory. This was something that was propagated in the Revolution. Modern historians take this idea to say that the American Revolution was feministic. There's also a large stream within English political theory and social policy that has this idea that the wife heads the household. You can find this here. And I would say this is probably some of the stronger arguments that the Puritans originated progressivism, or that you could secularize this and get progressivism out of it. It's just that we don't reach the whole doctrine. And certainly if you do this to other groups, this test, what if you secularized it? I think there are better fits, at least by proportion. So anything else before we get to the equal application of the law? All right.
I just want to get to the age ways and talk about the elders, unless you have more on gender applications of law.
Yeah, just to cap
yeah,
it
go ahead.
off, I have this quote here. And this is sort of like the empirical evidence. Fisher just says, it is important to note that these disciplinary proceedings tended to be remarkably even-handed as to the treatment of husbands and wives. A comparative study of adultery in New England and the Chesapeake finds that men and women convicted of this offense commonly received similar punishments in Massachusetts, but in Maryland courts, women were punished much more severely than men. So, and there's also a part later where it's just for everyone convicted of adultery, not only were they given somewhat similar punishment, but also men and women were both found guilty of this in the proper cases. So this is a sort of an equal application of the law to men and women. In contrast to the last part on the role of the woman in the household, I would say that this is not necessarily progressive, equally applying the law. Especially in the case of adultery. But I think I'll hold off with my explanation until we get to the Chesapeake colony, and we can sort of see what it looks like in the opposite. What if you only applied it to women? So, Mr. Charlemagne, I believe you wanted to get to the ageways.
Yes, so just a few things of note in here, but I thought they were interesting to point out. There was a reference to a phrase we use now, and I found a couple cases of this in the book. So there was a clergyman named Job Orton at the time. He used the phrase, "We have old heads to contrive and advise, and young hands to work." I thought it was interesting that he used the term old heads, which is a term we actually use right now to describe people who have been around a long time. And, basically in New England, or not New England, but the Puritan colony in particular, the elders were granted a particular respect and reverence, sort of as being closer to God in their age, and being selected to survive to that old age was sort of a symbol of their piousness. They also had the idea of the gray champion, which is a motif we see throughout English literature and storytelling now. There's one particular story of a gray champion helping a group of townspeople fight against hostile Indians, and he led them in battle and then simply disappeared. No one had any idea who he was. This is a sort of almost, I could say, obviously a figure like Gandalf or something, who comes from England in terms of the origination of his story, but you can kind of see the connection there. This idea of an old, wizened, wise leader who will champion his people is very much a New England motif. There's also something in their deathways that I found, or in the section on their deathways, pretty interesting. If we could bring up page 115, I have a quote I want to read, and this is something called the New England Way, and I found this interesting because it's basically a very old version of "It's so over, we're so back." I mean, quite literally, it's sort of a bit of comic relief in a sense, but it's very much true. So this is reading from a diary of a Puritan named Thomas Shepard, a minister, and on February 15th he wrote, "I was in prayer, and in the beginning of it, that promises came in, 'Seek me and you shall live.' My heart made me choice of God alone, and he was a sweet portion to me. The next day, Shepard's mood suddenly changed. I saw my heart was not prepared to die, because I had not studied to wean my heart from the world. O Lord, help me, a perishing thing." There were no diary entries for a week. This is page 116 now. Then Shepard's spirits lifted. February 23rd. On bed, I considered how sweetly the Lord was sometimes with me, and so how I should preserve that spirit and go forward. But that same night he was overtaken by despair. At night after lecture I saw my vileness. The Lord made me see nothing but shame to belong to me. And these diary entries of "It's so over, we're so back" kind of capture this thing called the New England Way, which is this particular Puritan fatalistic attitude of these, as the author, Mr. Hackett Fisher says, wild swings of hope and despair. And these colored their attitudes towards life and death itself. That's why it's in the Deathways chapter or section, because these are sort of attitudes they had towards their death and their final judgment. What did you guys take note of this as well? And
Yeah, it's very interesting. What you have here is the interplay of two Calvinist ideas, being total depravity and unconditional election, the idea that your fate is ultimately in God's hands. And so it's understandable why the Puritans felt this way. What's really interesting is the way that these same two ideas, have kind of a different attitudinal result in the backcountry, as we'll examine, and as was best exemplified by the famous words of Stonewall Jackson, that he felt as safe in his bed as he did on the battlefield because his life was in God's hands and the hour of his death had been ordained before time. And whereas that those two ideas working in tandem create this intense sense of peace and optimism for the backcountry peoples, it creates this intense sense of dread and anxiety in the Puritan strain. And it's there are many reasons why these two same ideas resulted in such a different interior forum amongst these two peoples, but it's very interesting to compare.
Right, and I have seen this tendency, this idea of a sort of divine dread as to whether one is good enough as one of the potential causes in the Puritan hypothesis of progressivism. But similar to the sort of one of the other points I made, this is I think that's a little bit too shallow. Like if one really has a strong conviction, and if one worries that one is not good enough to fulfill that conviction, that's not necessarily progressivism. That's just caring very deeply, having a very deep religious belief about something. It's a great argument for progressivism being like a religious sect, but it's not an argument that the Puritans or the Calvinists caused it.
Absolutely, it's not a cause and effect, but it is a correlation that you see between the two modes of thought, and it expresses itself in progressivism, as I alluded to earlier, in the need to virtue signal, to prove to yourself and to others that you are good, and you're good because you believe the right things. The Puritans obviously were not in for virtue signaling in the same way, but you can kind of see why people would see the similarity.
Well, especially because,
Right.
as we've touched on, the community held everyone else in it to the standards of the community, as was covered in that case of the neighbors bringing a case against the husband, and also in the sending out tradition of how children were raised. So there's very much an aspect in Puritan culture where they mutually uphold each other to the appropriate standard of their society, where
Yeah, and
the individual members fail.
we glossed over this earlier, but an example of that is it was not easy to join a church in Massachusetts. Like you had to go before the elders, satisfy them that you were a believer of the correct doctrines, and then you had to relate to them, a conversion experience, a spiritual moment when they were told by God that they were elect. And if you couldn't do that, you weren't getting into a church.
In relation to this idea, perhaps we should take a look at their magic ways, unless I'm jumping ahead of anything on
Well,
page.
yeah, just before we move on, I would say that on this topic of sort of correlation or similarity of progressivism, it also does contain the point of divergence between the two, because in this Puritan doctrine, I should say, they had this idea that if you were sure of your salvation or of your electedness, then you were most certainly not elect. This is something that if one wants to believe the claim that progressivism is the secularized Puritanism, this is something that has been dropped. Progressives believe that they are the good, and therefore everything else follows from it. The Puritans, not necessarily so, especially not about their own persons. The community could apply it to other people. There was these ideals, doctrines that had to be upheld in their community. But there was no self-assurance, certainly, and that's what causes this excerpt that we started from, this cycle between it's so over, we're so back, this melancholy and bipolarness.
So on page 125, tying into some of the things we just discussed, there's this orientation toward God's wonders and His providence. And the chapter begins by mentioning how, like other Christians of the time, they lived in this world of wonders that included unicorns in the hills beyond the Hudson, mermaids in the waters, and this sort of thing. But in addition to this, they had some very particular magic ways, which was, as it says here, quote, very special in their intensity. One of these beliefs might be called providential magic, for it was closely linked to the Puritans' faith in the all-powerful rule of God's providence. Even more than most people in their time, they searched constantly for clues to God's purposes in the world. It was this impulse which led so many English Puritans to study nature with that extraordinary intensity which played a central part in the birth of modern science. It also expressed itself in a continuing obsession with any wonder that might possibly be a sign of what they called God's remarkable providences in the world, or remarkables for short, end quote. And that's all I wanted to say on their magic ways in particular. And that's above and beyond the most important part of their magic ways is this fascination with God's providence and looking for the signs of it in the world.
A fundamentally divinatory understanding of magic.
Now, I think at this point we should move to the Cavaliers family and the family to death ways is basically the categories we just covered regarding the Puritans. Does that sound good?
Well, if I could just do like a lightning round, sort of going through the other conservative tendencies of Puritans, just so that the audience knows that this isn't just a conjecture on my part, but that this book is
Sure.
full of a very conservative reading of the Puritans. So basically every Puritan sort of mundane cultural aspect, like say their food, what was their food like? Well, what they were trying to do, they were trying to import England into the Bay Area. So there's a very fun passage in the section about Puritan food. So they were influenced by their Puritan ideals, of course. But this is what I found interesting. The leading historian of this subject finds a strong culinary conservatism in the first generation of Puritans. 17th century New England, writes Sarah McMahon, was intent on maintaining the traditional English fare. New England's foodways also owed much to the Christian asceticism of its founders, who were among the earliest Americans to associate plain cooking with piety and vegetables with virtue. And this is why they sort of adapted to the more plain vegetables that they had around them. And there's a passage that continues this. The Puritans showed little interest in these delights, except when driven by hunger to consume them. Shellfish, and the delights being like the natural abundance of the New England area, shellfish was regarded with grave suspicion. Shadroe, a gourmet's delight, was used as fertilizer. In the first year, John Winthrop complained when he was compelled to eat oysters and wild duck instead of the staples of old England. "My dear wife," he wrote, "we are here in a paradise, though we have not beef and mutton." The sense of sameness in New England foodways was deepened by its dining habits. On Yankee tables, every dish arrived at the same time, all piled together without regard for French doctrine of courses. So they're basically trying to import what they grew up with in England. This is not an idea that they were going to adapt to the New World. They did not see themselves as changing things. In fact, they spurred against that and tried to import England to the Bay Area. So this is something that I think this idea that permeates even to their food, I think should be taken into account, as well as this fact on the homeland itself. So there's this passage, and this will be the last one I'll quote just for the sake of brevity. The passage says, "This aching sense of physical separation from the European homeland became a cultural factor of high importance in colonial settlements. The effect of distance created feelings of nostalgia, anxiety, and loss. The prevailing cultural mood became profoundly conservative, a spirit reinforced by immigration from England, by the rigors of the Atlantic Passage, and by the sense of distance from the Old World. For my own part," wrote Lucy Winthrop Downing, "changes were ever irksome to me, and the sea much more." So this is a profoundly conservative, self-consciously conservative idea that permeated Puritan society. And I won't quote it. You can see this in their economics as well. They were very regulationist in a conservative sense. They completely eschewed profit. They viewed profit with suspicion, and they had a very regulationist view of production, that everything had to reach a certain quality. This was not a liberal or a progressive faction necessarily. Certainly, they were not motivated by the same things that progressive regulationists were motivated by.
And to underscore, you really can't overstate the centrality of these dining room customs to the New England identity, even up into the present day. To jump forward 3 centuries, I would encourage the audience to read a play called The Dining Room by A.R. Gurney. This is a delightful play which consists of a dozen or so vignettes of New England life over the course of about a century, all of which take place in a New England dining room, and really explores the impact that dining and dining culture has on New Englanders throughout their entire history.
Now, we only have a few more things earmarked for this stream on the Puritans. Do you want to finish those off, or do you want to perhaps return to them after we talk about the Cavaliers, or shall we just run through them?
I think they were mostly just for my reference. So like I said, the Puritans, especially on economics, which I don't want to read at length because it's a long section and pretty boring, they had a religious suspicion of most forms of profit. There was a legitimate form, but it was not the common form. And beyond that, they regulated things to be in line with their theology, not necessarily to like maximize any benefit. They did not regulate things to make work or any of these other more progressive ideas as they would express themselves in the United States later. They regulated things because it was the thing they had to do by their theology, and they directly derived it from it. I think that's the most important part of the Puritans that I had left that we hadn't discussed.
All right. I'll just run through some things I had really quick so we could round that out. There's some interesting aspect to the Puritans. We could get into it more next stream if we want to, but this concept of lawful recreation, they had highly regulated recreation, of course. They highly discouraged horse racing. They did play football, however, which we would call soccer, but they also had an interesting sport called biddle battle, which eventually became known as baseball. Which of course is modern day baseball. So that was one of their, based, literally BASTE, baseball. That was one of their lawful types of recreation. Just an interesting footnote there for historical purposes. We also have this idea of time as money, which is actually a degeneration of their ideas of time. So the Puritans, and this is the last thing I'll cover, is they had this quantitative view of time in that time was something to be improved, and your time should be used in a way that doesn't waste it. And we're not talking about money here. We're talking about wasted in a spiritual sense. This did eventually become the idea that time is money. And actually, on page 159, we have a bit from Benjamin Franklin here, and he just writes that, remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and goes abroad or sits idle 1/2 of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense. He has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides. So I thought that was interesting because it demonstrates how their original conception of time as something that was precious and to be used basically in the glory of God, that basic conception of how time should be used kept around, but it became oriented towards making money. There's one more thing actually on the Puritans I wanted to mention, was just their attitude towards the night. They had this particular fear of the dark, and night walking was actually illegal, basically being outside at night after curfew. And the night to them seemed evil. And this is interesting. There are obviously a lot of reasons for that in the American wilderness. The Indians among the forest, certainly not the only reason. But that was pointed out by the author, that they had a particular tendency to view the night as evil, not just be afraid of it.
Right, and I think we have an article on the Old Glory Club Substack on this point. I believe it's from John of Knights of Descent on the difference between American and European forests. I believe it's him that wrote that. But that is this prevailing idea, even to this day, that the American forests are something to be feared, as opposed to the European conception, which is a much milder version of that.
So let's now move on to the Cavaliers, and we didn't get into this too distinctly, but the Puritans organized their towns in a very specific way, limiting their sizes for the purposes of maintaining very strict communities. Now, for the Virginians, as the author writes, their dominant feature was the Chesapeake Bay, and you could look up this bay on the map and see how the sheer abundance of waterways that allowed the Virginians to settle in a different way, where there's this phrase of the omission of towns, where there was 6,000 miles of usable shoreline, which allowed for the people of the Chesapeake Bay to settle in a very dispersed way, in a very amphibious way that was quite different from the way the Puritans settled in very discreetly organized towns. So I just wanted to mention that before we start comparing them. If there's nothing else you'd like to say in preamble, we should get to the family to death ways of sections of the Cavaliers and contrast that with the Puritans. I know you had some particular references on the Cavaliers as well. Do you want to start here, or shall I?
Yeah, I think it'd be better if you start, because mine is a much less comprehensive overview and was much more comparative, purely because I thought people had more familiarity with the Puritans after so much aspersions towards them.
Okay, well, let's see what I have here on their family ways, page 275. Ah, yes. This was interesting. So, reading from page 275, quote, individuals in Virginia were stereotyped by traits that were thought to be hereditary in their extended families. Anglican clergyman Jonathan Boucher believed that family character of both body and mind may be traced through many generations. As for instance, every Fitzhugh has bad eyes, every Thornton hears badly, Winslows and Lees talk well, Carters are proud and imperious, and Taliaferros mean and avaricious, and Foxes cruel. Virginians often pronounced these judgments upon one another. The result was a set of family reputations which acquired the social status of self-fulfilling prophecies. End quote. Additionally, page 277, the author points out that more than 3/4 of Virginia-born children were lost at an early age, before reaching the age of, or lost, and they also lost at least one parent before reaching the age of 18 if they survived, on average. So, death at an early age was much more common in Virginia than it was in the New England colonies. It was something that could really strike at any season, out of the blue, as compared to the much unlikelier circumstances of catching deadly diseases in the New England colonies. Because of this, Virginia families organized them in much more extended ways. So you might find orphans, half-brothers, step-brothers, and step-sisters in any household. And the father figure could be an uncle or a brother. So you had far more diversity in the actual structure of the families as opposed to these strictly organized nuclear families, as a consequence of the environment that they were formed in. This wasn't a religious imperative or anything like that. It was just a consequence of where they settled. So you can see how the geography defined these two societies in necessarily different ways. We can also note, and this I found particularly interesting, page 279, quote, a gentleman of Virginia took pride in his hospitality and gained honor by his display. Those who accepted his invitation tacitly agrees to place themselves under his protection and authority. This custom had long existed in England, but in the 17th century, English country houses were rapidly closing their doors to all but invited guests. Skipping ahead a little, in Virginia, the good and ancient way of open hospitality continued to flourish for a longer time. While it survived, a Virginia patriarch extended the word family to include all the people who slept under his roof. So you can see this, of course, is alluding to this idea we have of Southern hospitality. And what that really means is this ancient tradition of uh, authority and responsibility for all who are under your roof, and they are basically to be treated as essentially your family members. And this is also tied to your honor. The Virginia culture was fundamentally an honor culture, especially among the landed gentry who ran the society.
Yeah, and as we would see this expressed in so many of the great Virginians of history, this tended to create men with a strong sense of responsibility to their families and their communities, and to essentially create unusually competent and plenipotentiary individuals. Famous examples: Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jefferson. This archetype very much grew out of this family structure.
Additionally,
Right, and I was just going to say very quickly, you can also, so if we're talking about the honor, it's somewhat similar to the backcountry, which we'll get to in a moment. This idea of all social customs being centered around honor, but unlike the backcountry, and the difference between the two, the honor here stems from a very ancient lineage, very ancient customs, things that have been imported from time immemorial from
You can read
England.
about this in the Odyssey. When Odysseus visits King Aeolus or various kings, you see the same thing happening. It's this strong hospitality honor culture where you welcome strangers into your house and you take them under your protection. And when they go, you send them off with gifts. It's more ancient than just England. This is central to the entire Western experience.
Right, and as Charlemagne mentioned at the beginning of this section of the stream, the environment, the geography allowed this to persist. If the Cavaliers, the Virginians, Chesapeake, whatever you'd like to call them, had organized by the tiny townships of the Puritans, this very centralized, or not in the political sense, but this very hierarchical, lineage-based honor culture, this very elaborate system, would not have been as practical. It would have struggled much more. But the large areas of settlement in Virginia, the cities that could be made along the waterways near the harbors, that's the environment supported this. It was very providential, if you will.
now, as I was going to say, what the heck was I looking at? Right. So the author compares the sex ways of the Puritans versus the Virginians, and he mentions that, quote, the people of Virginia thought less of the biblical commandment to increase and multiply and replenish the earth, which so obsessed the Puritans, and more of breeding stocks and bloodlines. Children of the elite were bred to one another in a manner not unlike dogs and horses. Much interest was shown in bloodlines. The gentry of Virginia studied one another's genealogies as closely as a stockman would scrutinize his stud books. And I actually didn't make a note of this, but there are cousonages in Virginia, which are basically these large extended family trees for particular groups. Basically, all of the Virginians, almost all of the Virginia aristocrats, the Virginia elites, they were all related to each other. So anybody on the Declaration of Independence who is from the colony of Virginia, they were cousins. You can be almost guaranteed of that. So these people very carefully intermarried their children among these elite families to maintain this aristocracy. We talk about how the South had this fledgling aristocracy at the time of the Civil War, or the war between the states, I should say, and not use the Yankee terminology. But that's almost inaccurate in the sense that their aristocracy was much older than that. It was transplanted directly out of England, and it maintained itself all the way up until the war between the states. So it's not that the South was building an aristocracy; they absolutely had one.
One amusing example of this is, I think they did a survey of the letters of one Virginia gentleman and found that he addressed 148 different people as cousin.
Which is probably literally true rather than an affectation. Now, on this note of family, they differed from the Puritans as well. We mentioned this concept of Puritan will breaking. I believe we had brought that up, if I recall. Hopefully, we don't skip over that.
Yes, we did bring it up.
Good. Okay. As opposed to the concept of will breaking in Virginia, and this is on page 311. If we want to bring up page 311, the Virginians were encouraged to develop strong and autonomous wills. So, but they were also expected to willingly yield themselves to the requirements of a hierarchical culture. So, Virginian elites were expected to be people of strong wills, but also able to bend that will. I believe the particular phrase the author uses is that the will was bent back against itself. So this differs pretty strongly from the Puritan conception.
Right. There's like a natural outgrowing, this concept of the lineage. You're a product of the lineage. You have to be refined still, but you don't have to be molded into the doctrine like the Puritans have. You have to be developed. It's an outgrowth of your natural inheritance, if you will.
And a broken will, as contrasted with the strengthened will, is obviously essential to men who are going to serve as these Southern patriarchs. If you're going to assume responsibility for potentially hundreds or thousands of people, a broken will not serve you well. And so it's easy to see where these two different conceptions of child rearing originated.
Something that children were taught too is this concept of etiquette and rules of right conduct. I'll just enumerate a few that give you some idea. Fear God, honor the king, reverence thy parents, submit to thy superiors, despise not thy inferiors, be courteous to thy equals. So you can see this rank ordering of society here, and in particular, the Virginians were taught something called condescension, which has a different implication than condescension would today. But it's basically this idea that one always shows the appropriate grace to people, grace and manners, regardless of their rank. So you would condescend in the sense that you would display manners to people below you in rank. The fact that they were below you did not mean that you could sort of mistreat them, basically. It was expected that you would act appropriately to people of all ranks in the society.
Before we move on,
Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't mean to draw too much of a connection here where there isn't one. But I think this idea of condescension, and especially by that name, could also easily be linked to the Anglican religion being much more, I would say Catholic, but that's going to start a theological debate. It was definitely more high church than the Puritans were, especially given the fact that these were royalists that governed the colony and formed its core. The condescension of Christ probably played a very big role in this idea that a superior had to humble himself before his guests. I would be shocked if that connection was never made.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because earlier I denoted how the Virginians weren't Protestant in the same way that many other colonists were. Now, of course, Anglicanism is a Protestant religion, but the variety of Anglicanism itself is fairly close to Roman Catholicism, but the Anglicanism of the Virginia elites was certainly a lot closer to Roman Catholicism than what we might associate with Anglicanism now. So it's important to keep that in mind, that these people have a much different religion than do all of the other people coming to America. I'll also mention, George Washington wrote a list of 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Um, and just a few of them are enumerated here. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Let your countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters somewhat grave. Let's see. In writing or speaking, give to every person his due title according to his degree and the custom of the place, etc. Things like this, right? And there's many of these in the chapter. So very strictly enumerated codes of conduct that they were expected to live by. Now, of course, these ideals were certainly not always upheld, as we will assuredly get into. But let's finish up on some of their family ways first. Page 321, the Anglican idea of the elder patriarch. And this probably will be fairly familiar to people based on what we've talked about, but quote, attitudes towards age and actual experience of aging were not the same in Virginia and Massachusetts. Respect for age was very strong in both cultures, but not in the same way. In place of the Puritan ideal of the venerated elder saint, Virginians organized a system of age deference around the paternal figure of the elder patriarch. So you would expect that, of course, in an aristocratic system, but it is worth quoting that in particular, that yes, these were fundamentally patriarchal societies in the very aristocratic sense, where you had a male head of the household who basically dictated the goings on within the family. And moving on to their death ways, they had a particular stoicism about them, which I found interesting. And this stoicism was developed within the elites because, as I mentioned, the prevalence of disease and death that afflicted them much more than disease affected the other New England colonies sort of led to this necessity of having a sort of stoic, accepting attitude towards death. And this was something that the Virginia gentlemen would be taught very early on. Is this, and obviously, if you look at our what we call the founding fathers, they are always displayed in this stoic way. The ones that are from Virginia, at least, contrasting. In most fictional depictions of the founding fathers, you often find that the character of Benjamin Franklin will be made to differ quite significantly, but from, say, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. I'm sure the viewers can bring to mind various depictions of these men as characters. Anything you two want to add here?
Well, we've comprehensively seen that the Virginians are, in fact, the true torchbearers of the authentic American right wing. Ryan, are there any idols you would like to smash?
Well, actually, before we get there, before we start smashing idols, there were a few things I'd like to do to build this one up a little bit more, and sort of even further demonstrate this.
Go
So
ahead.
similar to how the Puritans had a conservative mood, and we mentioned this at the introduction, you can say the Virginians had a hyper-conservative mood. It was to a much greater extremity. It was much more self-conscious, and to the point to where even the less conscious accidentally were hyper-conservative. So this is a good excerpt from the book. The colonial mood became especially strong in Virginia, where it was reinforced by the values of an English culture that tended to be profoundly conservative in every sense, elitist, hierarchical, and strenuously hostile to social change. The writings of Sir Robert Filmer, the political philosopher whose family was so closely connected with Virginia, expressed these attitudes with exceptional clarity and force. One modern student of his thought observes that Filmer, quote, succeeds in justifying the status quo in every little, almost accidental detail. He tried to prove that the slightest change in anything that went to make up the world as he knew it could be disastrous. Filmer was not alone in these opinions. Almost any royalist diary or commonplace book revealed the same worldview. The Hampshire gentleman Sir John Oglander warned others to, quote, take heed of innovation, of bringing in any new device into our island. Words such as innovation, novelty, and modern were pejorative terms. So that last part's a funny similarity with the Puritans, because I think the exact sentence is quoted in the Puritans verbatim: innovation, novelty, and modern, but not with the same meaning. The Virginians took this to a much deeper level. It was core to their social society, to their society, I should say. And you can see these more ancient, very conservative expressions, even in their tolerance of originally pagan traditions, say in their marriage ceremonies. So this is quoting on the Virginian marriage ceremonies. The bride and groom in Virginia were often united in two ceremonies, both of which were condemned in Puritan New England. The first was a Christian ceremony, which was solemnized sometimes in a church, or more often in the bride's home, but always by a minister according to the laws of the Anglican Church and the Book of Common Prayer. The other ceremony was an ancient pagan practice in which the bride and groom were made to jump over a broomstick. This ritual had long been observed throughout Britain and much of Western Europe, and especially in the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, which were on the maps at the beginning for this folkway.
I did notice a distressing lack of broomsticks at a wedding I attended recently. It was very anti-trad.
Yeah, well, so it goes. The custom of the broomstick marriage came to be widely practiced by white families throughout the southern colonies, in addition to the Christian ceremony. For black slaves, it was the only type of marriage ceremony that was permitted, and rapidly acquired a special meaning in Afro-American culture. So I don't read that off just because I'm particularly interested in the Cavalier or Royalist marriage ceremonies, but rather to show that there's a tolerance for pagan traditions, which had been baptized, if you will. They were seen as innocuous or benign by the Christian church at this time. But they were traditions. They had been adopted. They were kept. The Puritans would have balked at this. This was against the Christian faith to take things from the heathen in such a manner and to affix it to such a solemnized covenant, as the Puritans would call it, as marriage. So this is and just to cap off this thing that we're building up here about the Cavaliers, the Royalists, the Virginians being very based in trad, as it were, everything that we have been talking about leads the Virginian to adopt a state of extreme nativism. I will quote part of this excerpt, and you can see why if you read the actual book. It's what the book writes. It's nothing too edgy, but I doubt that YouTube would be too happy. Fisher says, another side of this aching nostalgia for the mother country was a strenuous hostility to strangers. In 1738, for example, William Byrd II wrote, I have learnt by long experience to be upon my guard against all strangers not well recommended, so that they can cheat me of nothing but my civilities. This attitude deepened into a positive hatred of foreigners, a category which included all people not English. The correspondence of 3 William Byrds overflowed with virulent prejudices against foreigners. They detested every nation except England and despised all races except their own. And this is not only applying, me talking here, this is not only applied to like the geographical origins of people, the nationalities, the heritage. It also applied to their religion. So that extended not just to only English people, only royalists, but also only Anglicans as well, this extreme nativism. And you can sort of see why this developed. Every other aspect of royalist society in the New World hinged around this nativism. You came from a family that had a specific place that it originated from and lived in for many generations. All the customs that one acquired was from one's soil, one's home, one's locality. And these had rulers that were natural rulers. All of the things about marriage that we've talked about so far, the sort of the selective breeding of an aristocracy, all centered around one particular place. This was very tied to a place and a people. So everything, as we've alluded to, everything's going so far based in trad. Everything's looking up for the online right. The Cavaliers are very clearly the people to emulate. They're the good part of America. Everyone else is cringe, progressive, modern, and whatever else you want to label them. Except as you keep reading, you start to see that royalist society in the New World has some faults to it that don't make it into the popular memes about the South. So on the topic of marriage, just to contrast before we get into this, the Puritans were very strict, as we discussed. It applied to all people. Marriage was a specific theology. You entered into it as a covenant. It had particular terminations if someone were to be as sinful as to do such a thing. And there were no exceptions. That was just how marriage was. Anything short of that was an abomination. In royalist society, however, there's a bit of leniency. So this excerpt here on Sarah Harrison, this is an outlier, an extremity, to be clear before I go into this, but it still happened, which is the point of interest. She was getting married to I believe it was a commissary, but I think I have his name in the excerpt. And she balked at the idea of obey being in the marriage vows. And she startled the congregation that her and the commissary were getting married in by saying, "No, obey." And the vows were repeated 3 times to let her get the correct answer. And 3 times she answered with increasing firmness, "No, obey," until Dr. Blair, there we go, the commissary that she's being married to, finally agreed to take his chances, and the wedding went forward without any promise of obedience. Their married life together proved to be deeply unhappy. Some years later, William Byrd noted in his if you could believe it, William Byrd noted in his diary, quote, "Went to the commissaries where I was very much surprised to find Mrs. Blair drunk, which is growing pretty common with her, and her relations disguise it under the name of consolation." Fisher continues, few women were as outspoken as Sarah Harrison, but many resisted by other means. Yet most were compelled to obey their husbands, often much against their will, in matters which they deeply cared about. Thus William Byrd compelled his wife to send her sick baby to Otway to her mother-in-law, who lived at a plantation which was thought to be more healthy. The wife replied, in quote, "I am very sorry you have limited poor sweet Otway, so that he has but a short time to stay with me. Poor dear babe, but sir, your orders must be obeyed, whatever reluctance I find thereby." And then Fisher concludes this section, "Here was a fertile source of domestic strife." So this is just getting at this idea. The Royalists were much more permissive towards dysfunctional marriages, which the Puritans just did not tolerate. And since the Puritans did not tolerate it, it did not happen. This is not something you would see in the Northeast. It's absolutely something you can find in the Royalists. And I was mentioning at the beginning that the Puritans held to this idea of the woman as sort of like the administrator of the household, the head of the family, something like that, which is a very progressive idea. But another English feminist current that you can find in feminist thought is this idea that the woman has means within the household to disobey her husband and move things in her direction. And this is what's being described here in Royalist Virginia in the 17th century. She can use basically a form of emotional manipulation. She can sort of try to nudge things in her direction, act as a de facto administrator, and sort of take over what would be the natural order, at least by the marriage vows. We'll go on in a moment, so I don't talk too long. We'll break this up, but this will become a common pattern. The Royalists were very permissive towards things that are seen as degenerate by the modern right. Anything to add so far?
I was also just going to quote from William Byrd II's diary a bit. Let's see. Jenny, October 20th, 1711. Jenny, an Indian girl, had got drunk and made us good sport. October 21st. At night, I asked a Negro girl to kiss me. Let's see. September 8th. Saw 2 women, a mother and daughter, who stayed about 2 hours, and then came Mrs. Johnson. Note that's Mrs. Johnson, with whom I supped and ate some fricassee of rabbit, and about 10 went to bed with her and lay all night and rogered her twice. September 11th. I wrote some English till 9, and then came Mrs. S. I drank a glass of wine to our good and then we went to bed and rogered her 3 times. However, I could not sleep and neglected my prayers. September 14th, about 8, I went to Mrs. Smith's where I met Molly and had some oysters for supper, and about 11 we went to bed and I rogered her twice. September 17th, about 7 I went to Mrs. Fitzabear's where I ate some boiled pork and drank some ale. About 9 I walked away and picked up a girl who I carried to the Bagnio and rogered her twice very well. It rained in abundance that night. Continuing, October 6th. Endeavored to pick up a whore, but could not. I neglected my prayers, for which God forgive me. October 7th. Picked up a whore and carried her to a tavern where I gave her a supper and we ate a broiled fowl. We did nothing but fool and parted about 11 o'clock, and I walked home and neglected my prayers. October 16th. Picked up a woman and went to the tavern where we had a broiled fowl, and afterwards I committed uncleanliness, for which God forgive me. About 11, I went home and neglected my prayers. October 17th. October 20th. To the play where I saw nobody I liked, so went to Will's and stayed about an hour, and then went to Mrs. Smith's, where I met a very tall woman and rogered her 3 times. November 14th. Went away to Will's, where a woman called on me. Then I went to a Bagnio, where I rogered my woman but once. Her name was Sally Cook. Yeah, I think you get the idea. From
Crypto-Catholic hypothesis confirmed.
Well, and Fisher does summarize all of this in more so in other places, but in this excerpt that I have here, just as a general pattern. So he didn't just draw these conclusions from this one guy's diary. This was a common theme throughout Chesapeake society. And he says that sexual relations between men and women tended to be less strictly regulated in the Chesapeake than in Puritan New England. They were also regulated in different ways. Rates of prenuptial pregnancy during the 17th and early 18th centuries were comparatively high in the Chesapeake region, higher than in Puritan colonies, particularly among indentured servants. In Somerset County, Maryland, more than a third of immigrant brides were pregnant before they married. Overall, about a fifth of all women who married in that county, immigrants and natives together, were carrying a child on their wedding day. And he does continue. Despite this tendency, or perhaps because of it, fornication was not punished as frequently or as severely in the Chesapeake colonies as it had been in New England. In Maryland, the courts did not often hear cases of this sort, despite very high rates of illegitimacy and prenuptial pregnancy. When they did so, the female was punished severely, usually by whipping, but the male either escaped with a token penalty, such as a bond for good behavior, or in most cases was not punished at all. So earlier, when we were discussing the Puritan pattern of equally enforcing marriage and adultery laws on both sexes, I mentioned that this may not necessarily be progressive. And in fact, I don't think it really is in general. And this is sort of why. You get the counterfactual in the Virginian society. What happens if you let one of the sexes go but punish the other? And the fact is that this behavior permeates society, especially among the higher classes, because this colony was so fixated and founded upon its hierarchies and aristocrats. I don't think this is a healthy society, certainly that should be emulated in this regard. This is not based, but it may definitely be trad.
I mean, it's based with a T.
Yeah. So, but this is, in fact, one of the last notes that I had here on this particular point for the Chesapeake colony. Fisher goes into some of the penalties for this. He says adulterous women were punished more harshly than adulterous men. For that offense, women were flogged severely or dragged through the water behind a boat until they nearly drowned. Men were treated leniently. This difference, though, was not the result of mindless or instinctive sexism. It rested upon the assumption that the bloodline within a family was threatened by a wife's adultery, but not by the husband's. That way of thinking was more important in Anglican Virginia than in Puritan New England. So this is when I've been emphasizing sort of this, the fact that Chesapeake is founded upon lineage, particular people, elites, and aristocrats, and this sort of very nativist and aristocratic view of things. This is what their laws are based upon. This is why they can punish women severely for adultery, but for men, it's a moral issue, perhaps, but it's not necessarily a societal issue in their mind. This is not something to be concerned with. Of course, if I had described this society to anyone in our spheres without saying it was from Albion seed on the Virginia colony, most people would have balked at this as a heavily degenerate society that would certainly be disintegrating sometime soon. But I imagine because people knew we were covering the royalists in Virginia from this book, perhaps this very significant detail was downplayed a little before we started discussing it.
Yes, the Cavaliers were easily the most degenerate culture on the American continent when those diary entries were written in 1711. That's for sure. So they were trad, but not based, at least not in the ways we would normally associate. So this is very important to point out. I mean, this is not to say there weren't, good and important things about the Virginians to our culture. Obviously, there are. This point is being made simply because the Virginian Cavaliers are the sort of natural group which a lot of our people would have a sort of affinity with, and I suppose our goal in reviewing all of that is to treat these matters historically and not again in some sort of feels based way, as has typified some of the discourse around these groups. We're coming up on the 2 hour mark now. I know we wanted to more or less make that our limit. Do we want to finish with the Virginians' magic ways, particularly their obsession with fortune, and then get into their food and time?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Yep.
Great. All right. We'll see where we go from there. So page 340, Virginia's magic ways. Now, their magic ways are more interesting than the Puritans, at least in my opinion. The author points out on page 340 that the Virginians were deeply interested in magic, even obsessed by it, but the quality of their obsession was not the same as in Massachusetts. In the Chesapeake colonies, there was nothing like the Puritans' concern with witchcraft. No person was ever executed in Virginia for that crime. Instead, the courts actively punished false accusations of witchcraft, often assessing heavy fines and costs against those who denounced their neighbors as minions of the devil. Many denunciations were indeed brought forward by people of low estate, particularly during the decade of the 1650s, which was a painful and uncertain period of the colony. But Virginia's ruling elite had little sympathy for witchcraft prosecutions, and actively discouraged them in a manner very different from the ministers and magistrates of Massachusetts. Then on page 341, page 341, at the same time, however, Virginians were very much interested in other forms of magic, which had comparatively little meaning for the people of New England. The gentlemen of Virginia were deeply absorbed in the study of stars, planets, spheres, and portents, not as signs of God's purpose, but as clues to their own fate. They believed that every man possessed a certain fixed quality called fortune, which could be understood by knowledge of these things. This idea had been widely accepted in Elizabethan England. Many gentlemen kept fortune books, which were their collections of magical and astrological lore for good luck in love, marriage, sex, health, travel. One such fortune book included an entire chapter on marriages, with entries on whether a man shall marry, the time of marriage, how many husbands a woman shall have, who shall be master of the two, how they shall agree after marriage, and whether the man or his wife shall die first, and the time when. This cult of fortuna implied that life was a game of chance in which the odds were rigged by mysterious powers of the universe. And then we have another quotation on page 342, which is on gambling. Before I read from this, would any of you like to comment?
Just that this is very much what you would expect. We talked earlier about how the Cavaliers were a much more ancient culture. And again, this goes back not just to England, but all of Europe. This is a very medieval Catholic conception of magic that is much more recognizable to Catholics than would some of the other conceptions of magic we'll talk about.
Right, and I find this very interesting because sort of the society that we've been describing for so long now on this topic of the Chesapeake, and at least how the cities are traditionally viewed, I would have said this is a very quintessentially New Orleans-ish. This idea of magic being something that was directly influencing your life, sort of a slightly more libertine society, somewhat more friendly, definitely much more enjoyable. I believe our friend Mr. Fahrenheit in the chat has been talking about the Southern live hard, die fast mentality. This is how I think Americans would have traditionally conceived of New Orleans, this town that sort of presents all of this in one area. But I'm not an expert on New Orleans. That's just the perception that I had of it for most of my life.
Well,
and
it's
it just feels
interesting
like I keep
because
describing it.
the period we're discussing is, of course, a century and a half before New Orleans actually came into the United States. So it's interesting to consider which way the causality runs there.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm not saying they caused it, but I am saying that this is I think that's proof it's a southern city, at least if the perception of New Orleans in that way is true.
Well, this next part certainly relates to part of that culture as well. So on page 342, this interest of fortune was linked to another striking characteristic of Virginians, their obsession with gambling. Virginians were observed to be constantly making wagers with one another on almost any imaginable outcome. The more uncertain the result, the more likely they were to gamble. They made bets not merely on horses, cards, cockfights, and backgammon, but also on crops, prices, women, and the weather. They are all professional gamesters, a French traveler observed of Virginia's gentry. Colonel Byrd is never happy but when he has the box and dice in his hand. Gambling had many meanings in the lives of Virginia planters. Historians have demonstrated that it was an expression of social status and a form of social bonding, but it was also something else. The Kabbalistic patterns that the dice made as they tumbled out of the box representing something more than merely an idle amusement, and something other than a form of status striving. A gentleman's dice were like the soothsayer's bones from which they had descended, a clue to the cosmos and a token of each individual's place within it. If the Puritans searched desperately for signs of God's redeeming providence in the world, the Virginians sought another sort of assurance about fortuna in their incessant gambling. And then I have another quotation on page 343. And it continues, in Massachusetts, gambling was strictly forbidden by law and severely punished by the magistrates. It was condemned by Puritan moralists as not merely idleness, but blasphemy. To John Cotton and John Mather, gambling made a mockery of God's presence in the world. The attitudes of Virginians were very different. Gambling was formally recognized and regulated by law. Betting was prohibited to those with no visible estate, profession, or calling to maintain themselves. Courts enforced wagers as a form of contract and required that gambling debts should be faithfully paid. Fraudulent gaming was ferociously punished, and the highest powers in the colony were invoked to secure honest games. This common law of wagering was an indication that gambling was much more than merely a game in Virginia. It was a way of testing one's fortuna. These attitudes were not invented in the New World. They had long existed among the gentry of the south and west of England, with whose gambling was also an obsession. The diary of the Dorset gentleman John Richards was also a betting book, which became a running record of many small wagers with friends and acquaintances. Richard often set down the results of bets in which he had no personal stake by other gentlemen who engaged in compulsively in heavy and even ruinous wagers. He was as much interested in the fortuna of others as of himself. Virginians of all ranks also showed still another interest in magic. On their house they carved signs which were thought to bring the occupants good fortune. Some of these signs were very old, older than the sign of the cross. They had long appeared on the buildings in the south and west of England, from whence so many Virginians came. These signs might be thought of as a sort of liturgy, that is, a ritual which was thought to be a way of precipitating the powers of fortune. End quote. So I wanted to include that last bit as well to link this culture back to England, to emphasize the idea that these cultures are very old and have a very long history to them, and let no one speak of any idea that Americans have no ethnicity or have not experienced an ethnogenesis. The only way anyone could claim that is if the English have also had no ethnogenesis in their country, which is obviously absurd.
Although, not uncoincidentally, a claim that is being made these days.
Indeed.
Right, and something else that I think is very important is this idea that none of these groups can really be dispensed of, and we can still have the same conception of America. Though I think that line of thinking will become more explicit next week when we devote a little bit more attention to the other two, the Quakers and the Backcountry, especially because we'll be talking about the more political aspects of these groups, the higher level concepts, learning, politics, freedom, and liberty. Which, if currently, if you're not convinced just by the cultures that we've been going through in overview or in depth and how they've shaped the United States, even at this time, you will most certainly be convinced next week. I am certain of that.
Yeah, so I think given the time, I'd like to cap this off with our Stream 1 topics and do the food and time ways of the Virginians, and then we'll cap it off there. We'll save the Quakers and the Backcountry People for next time, along with other topics that are going to go back to all four of them. So, page 351, food. This is again on William Byrd II. It's commented that Byrd enjoyed fried chicken. And that as early as the first decade of the 18th century, fried chicken had become a distinct regional favorite in Virginia. Later in the 18th and early 19th century, some Virginia cookery books dismissed fried chicken as a vulgar dish, but that view was not shared by the Byrds and Carters, who tucked into their fried chicken with high enthusiasm. This style of Southern cooking became the basis of a distinctive regional foodway in America, highly seasoned with much roasting, simmering, and frying. It was similar to the regional cuisine of southern and western England, where frying, simmering, and sautéing in a skillet were methods of preparation called Dorset fashion or Dorset cooked. And I wanted to bring this up, and there's some additional quotations about salty bacon, pungent cheese, peppery sausage, which is also characteristic of the south and west of England. These foodways are for one not African, and two they're fundamentally American and also English. And I thought that was worth bringing up here, particularly this note about fried chicken, because obviously there's a particular stereotype associated with that. But this is true of pretty much anything you find. This will come up a lot, I think, in the speechways. But many aspects of our culture that one might associate with another race are actually not from that race at all and predated. Pretty much anything you could think of in American culture that we ascribe to blacks actually came from England itself and developed further in America. And that's really important to emphasize here, because there's been a sort of hijacking of parts of our culture in order to take these things away from Americans, right? When in fact they are fundamentally American.
Now we also even normicons understand that. Like that was a major talking point of Thomas Sowell, which is well beyond our sphere now. But this is not something that's really controversial, at least in honest history.
I think Southerners who might be listening will be familiar with this next part on page 353. Southern foodways were also special in another way. Feasting was an important part of the culture of Virginia, more so than in Massachusetts. The people of New England did a good deal of heavy eating and drinking from time to time, particularly after the death of a neighbor or townsman. But feasts in Virginia happened very frequently, at weddings and christenings, at Christmas and Easter, the return of a family member, or the visit of an interesting stranger. And they were very much more festive. A Virginia feast could be staged on short notice or no notice at all. A French traveler in the 17th century was present at one impromptu occasion in the year 1686 when 20 mounted Cavaliers suddenly descended on William Fitzhugh's plantation, and a feast was instantly improvised for them. "We rode 20 strong to Colonel Fitzhugh's," he wrote, "but he had such a large establishment that he did not mind. We were all of us provided with beds, one for 2 men. He treated us royally, and there was good wine and all kinds of beverages, so that there was a great deal of carousing. He had sent for 3 fiddlers, a jester, and a tightrope dancer, an acrobat who tumbled around, and they gave us all the entertainment one could wish." So obviously that's a much bigger display than most people would be familiar with, but this concept of the feast is something that persists throughout the South to this day, at least in my experience as a Southerner.
Yeah, again, that's a very old feudal custom, from the earliest days of the early medieval period. The local lord, a big part of how he established his legitimacy was in feasting his men. And this is the same pattern you see repeated here on the aristocratic culture of Virginia.
So on their aristocratic culture, and I really like this part of the book, page 365 on the Virginia workways, the ambivalence of the Cavalier ethic. We could say that a gentleman strives to not work, essentially. And let's see. The author points out that most Virginia gentlemen worked harder than they cared to admit. I mean, this is simply the reality of the New World, especially given that they were on tobacco plantations in large part, and tobacco was a particularly unforgiving crop in the attention to detail in growing it. But the author also writes that the ethic of work was very weak in this society. As early as 1622, John Martin observed that in the Chesapeake, even the Indians work better than the English. The Virginians themselves commonly agreed with this assessment. From the planter's perspective, William Byrd wrote, "Nature is very indulgent to us and produces its good things almost spontaneously. Men evade the original curse of hard labor and sweat as much as eating their bread at getting it. If plenty and a warm sun did not make us lazy and hate motion and exercise." So he comments on the tyranny of the heat there, which is a major factor in their work ethic, which is basically trying to do as little of it as possible. Page 366. Robert Beverly shared this view. In a book that generally celebrated the virtue of the Virginians, he wrote, "I must reproach my countrymen with a laziness that is unpardonable." Beverly believed that the problem developed not from the climate, but from the culture, and particularly from the inability of Virginians to think in what he called economic terms. "Nay," he declared, "they are all such abominable ill husbands that though their country is overgrown with wood, yet they have all their wooden ware from England." These judgments did not accurately describe material conditions in Virginia, but it did reveal an important truth about their cultural attitudes. And basically, this is the concept of the gentleman. The gentleman strove to demonstrate that he did not work hard, basically because others in his pay would be working for him. Page 367. Quote, "The same ambivalence also appeared in attitudes towards money, which Virginians liked to have but hated to handle." And I'll stop the quote there, but this is a particular attitude you often see towards how the rich, properly upper class people actually handle money. It's something that they have, but they don't like talking about or thinking about.
Right, and just before we continue slightly, I think that we've established enough here, like the sort of Southern aristocrat archetype, the gentleman, as Fisher calls him. I really was thinking about the sort of meme that came out of the Evola craze from 2019 and 2020, where suddenly everyone viewed himself as an aristocrat and a gentleman. Many people who themselves were absolutely no such thing. And it's because the life that's being described here is definitely desirable for the vast majority of people. But it's also, number one, as evidence in the name, not for everybody. And number two, this is not necessarily the most. This is not the archetype that you would necessarily want in sort of like a civilizational catastrophe. The gentleman is not the one that's going to get his hands dirty as much as everyone else. He's not a worker after all. He's also not necessarily a politicker. That's somewhat ungentlemanly. They're aristocrats and they're rulers by birth. They're not used to having to scramble for popular public support, at least in the same intentional way as others. This is something to be promoted for a very few people, few people for which this life is basically made for them. But this is not, I think, a popular ideal.
Resentment of the yeomanry.
Well, I mean, I don't think I'm resentful because I know this is not me. But I do recall seeing many people claiming to be an aristocrat and just using it as an excuse to live with high time preference, shall we say. when that's not what being a gentleman is. So that's another idol, perhaps, that I would like to at least dent on this stream.
And
A moderate ding.
the relation to wealth and these people as well was that it was sort of essential to the idea of being a gentleman. Not It's something that they would consume for pleasure, but it was also expected that you would display your wealth in a liberal way, being that you would spend it on others at these feasts or other grand events. Your ability to just sort of spend wealth loosely was part of being a gentleman. But of course, magnanimity, exactly, and this is certainly something you continue to see in Southern culture today. But of course, this brought the South into debt. In the interest of time, we won't belabor that too much, but during the War of Independence, the Americans owed £3 billion to the British, and more than half of that, or nearly half, was from the Virginia planters. So these people were chronically in debt. Not all of them, but many of the families were chronically in debt. Let's jump to page 368 and the Cavalier idea of killing the time. In the interest of time, we won't spend a lot of time on time, but whereas the Puritans had this idea of improving the time and basically using it for spiritual purposes, the Virginians actually sought a way to kill time, which is basically find things to do to make the time pass. Probably because it was just so dang hot, I would imagine. But this sets them apart from the Massachusetts people as well. Let's see. I have a note here on tobacco. This is essential to their time ways. If we could bring up page 369 on the screen. Tobacco, the tobacco cycle. Page 370, this tobacco cycle exercised a complete temporal tyranny over the lives of Virginians. It created alternating periods of crisis and calm and culminated in climactic moments of frantic intensity. And this is due to a very particular time that you have to harvest tobacco and a particular worm that could annihilate your entire crop. So the life cycles of Virginia were highly dominated by this crop, which imposed a sort of tyranny on these people's estates. And I have one last thing on time, unless you guys want to add anything there. And
I mean, there's sort of a literary quality where the South, despite having this in theory free class that has leisure time and wealth at their expense, as a result of their lifestyle, they're sort of enslaved themselves to the land around them, to the creditors. It's a very vicious thing that the South has been subjected to. Which, once again, that's not to say that this folkway is entirely bad or anything like that, but it definitely does have its problems that haven't really been expounded upon by our spheres as much.
That's actually ties into the next point, which is this sort of being enslaved to the land, being under this tyranny of tobacco. I think that plays into this idea in gentlemanly status being demonstrated by temporal independence. Basically, this ability to stay out late, wake up early, basically treat your time however you wanted. I suppose this would demonstrate great gentlemanly status if you weren't under the tyranny of tobacco as much as some of the other plantation holders. Particularly this diary of Bullen Rains is noted. And he actually alternates it in bad French and English. So the author says, or Fisher says, one morning he might rise at 6 or earlier. On another, he would stay abed till noon or even later. Early risings tend to be recorded in English. Late sleepings were noted in a fractured French. And the diary reads, J'ai dormi tout le matin, which is, I slept to the morning, I guess. And then, J'ai dormi jusqu'à 2 heures, which I think is until noon. So it looks like when he sleeps late, he writes it down in French, in apparently what's inaccurate French. And then Fisher continues. This English gentleman kept his incessant schedule not because it merely pleased him, it also demonstrated his independence, a condition fundamental to the status of a gentleman. And that's all I have on time. And with that, I'd like to get the super chats and save everything else for the next stream. Is there anything you guys want to add before we read these super chats out?
The main takeaway throughout, especially these first few streams that we'll be doing, this first handful, is definitely that America originates from specific people at specific places with specific beliefs. All three of those things are necessary. It's what historically is true about America. It's what shaped it, and it's the core of the country. If you try to remove any of those three things, the people, the beliefs, or the place, you don't have an America anymore. So we've been emphasizing this point very much throughout this, but that includes all four of the folkways that we're describing on this stream in particular. No matter how subversive they've been memed to be, there are good parts to them. There are bad parts. They're all workable. They all produce societies which function well, that produced, quite frankly, one of the greatest nations in the world. It's just that I feel like the memes have been doing a great disservice to all these places, as has the constant barrage of propaganda saying that there is no people called Americans, there's no place, it's an idea. So this is all of these things are inadequate, and hopefully this sort of repairs that inadequacy.
And this project of rediscovery and reconnection is fundamental to any synthesis of a plan going forward for how we are to address the issues which Americans face.
All right. Well, with that, why don't we get to the super chats? So, fortunately, we don't have a whole lot because we've kind of gone over time here. Chansey of NW. What could that be? Northwest, Newark. Evening, gents. Hail the OGC. Needed now more than ever. Thank you very much for your $5.02. What a strange number. There's actually a bunch of strange numbers. Next, by SkiBum220, we have $20.09. He just sends us a salute, along with Seasider for $10.04, also sending us a salute. A salute to you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the donations.
Salute to you, Seasider.
And the same.
Maple Copperhead, again for $10.04. Is there some sort of tax on what's going on with that number? Salute, gentlemen. Looking forward to your amazing new content coming. Thank you for what you do. And then we have Harvey Wallbanger, our Virginia gentleman, for $10.04 as well, sending us a salute. Thank you very much, Mr. Copperhead and Mr. Wallbanger. And now we have a salute that completely BTFOs all the other salutes. Lord Inquisitor Ahashion sends us a massive $200 donation. Thank you very much for this. That will cover
Thank you.
That will, well, it's not like I get the money or something, but that's about how much I spent on the first five books we're going to be doing on this show.
Yes, thank you very much, Inquisitor. We shall endeavor to avoid your baleful glare.
And thanks for sending it on
you.
Entropy, because we get a much bigger cut out of Entropy. Maybe being having the YouTube super chats unavailable is actually not a bad thing. So thank you very much for that donation. It will definitely be put to good use. We next have Chase Steely for $25. He just says cheers. Cheers to you as well.
A difficult act to follow, but you're appreciated even so, Chase.
We have Solid Snake 1964, our usual first super chat for $5. Somehow people have now figured out not to add on additional cents. Interesting. Thank you, gentlemen, for the extra content I can listen to at work. Hope you all had a great 4th. Salute to the OGC. Thank you very much for your $5, Mr. Solid Snake. As well as Yeehaw Yinzer, who also sends us $5. Good evening and a salute. Thank you very much, and a salute to both of you. Friend of the show, Yiz the Eunuch, sends us $3. This already feels like a cigar stream, but better. White Heart, thank you very much, Yiz. I'm glad you appreciate this.
All resemblances to previous streaming products are purely coincidental.
Cyber Chud for $25. Thank you to the OGC History Maxers. Indeed, we are History Maxed. Like I said, we've got a large series planned ahead. I've got a stack of 5 books, including Albion Seed, and this is only the first stream on Albion Seed, so be sure to join us at this time next week for the second part and conclusion to our Albion Seed mini-series starting out this show.
We hope we conclude next week.
I really hope we do. We went over time now, but it's not too bad for the first go, Then we have
I think
Melon.
we'll get through it. Yeah.
For $25. I don't have anything witty to say. Good job, gents. Well, thank you, Melon. Judge Lot, $15. Excellent show, gentlemen. Thank you very much. And finally, Son of Hester, our man in New England. Hopefully, we are doing you proud. For $10, as he says, excited to see this new show and what an important first book to cover. Especially good reading for my chapter members in New England. Yes, indeed. And I highly encourage people to read this book. There's so much more in this book that I wish we could have gotten into even today, but we're already over time on our target goal. So with that, I will recommend you read the book. Maybe you can read a couple of 100 pages before next week if you can find a copy. I actually found mine at the local bookstore, funnily enough. So thanks everyone for the super chats. Remember to sign up for Entropy to continue super chatting to us, because that's going to be the only way to do it for a little while. So with that, we will conclude part 1 of our Albion's Seed review for this inaugural I've been talking for too long. Inaugural episode of American Spirits.
It is inarguably inaugural.
Indeed.
I might just say, for anyone watching at home who might read along, the parts that we'll be covering next are the more societal parts of the Four Folkways, and there will be a lot more focus on them since all the idol breaking has mostly been done for this time, but only a few are reserved for next week. This stream is more focused on the people, the place, and the beliefs. Next week we'll be focusing on a little bit more of their societal impact, how it came to form American political thought, ideologies, and beliefs that we hold today. If you want to follow along, that's the sort of middle section of each of the Four Folkways: speech, building, learning, liberty, or freedom. I think it's called freedom in the book, if you want to follow along.
We also had a request in chat to discuss the Dutch question next week, so we'll have to bookmark that as well.
I think we'll be discussing the Quakers plenty next week.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you both for joining me for